Bashō, The Records of a Travel-Worn Satchel. In this mortal frame of mine, which is made of 100 bones and 9 orifices, there is something. And this something is called a wind-swept spirit, for lack of a better name. For it is much like a thin drapery that is torn and swept away at the slightest stir of the wind. The something in me took to writing poetry years ago, merely to amuse itself at first, but finally making it its lifelong business. It must be admitted, however, that there were times when it sank into such dejection that it was almost ready to drop its pursuit. Or again times when it was so puffed up with pride that it exulted in vain victories over the others. Indeed, ever since it began to write poetry, it has never found peace within itself, always wavering between doubts of one kind and another. At one time, it wanted to gain security by entering the service of a court, and at another, it wished to measure the depth of its ignorance by trying to be a scholar. But it was prevented from either because of its unquenchable love of poetry. The fact is, it knows no other art than the art of writing poetry, and therefore it hangs onto it more or less blindly. Saigyo in traditional poetry, soji in linked verse, sesshu in painting, rikyu in tea ceremony, and indeed all who have achieved real excellence in any art possess one thing in common, that is, a mind to obey nature, to be one with nature throughout the 4 seasons of the year. Whatever such a mind sees a flower, and whatever such a mind dreams of is the moon. It is only a barbarous mind that sees other than the flower, merely an animal mind that dreams of other than the moon. The first lesson for the artist is, therefore, to learn how to overcome such barbarism and animality, to follow nature, to be one with nature. It was early in October when the sky was terribly uncertain that I decided to set out on a journey. I could not help feeling vague misgivings about the future of my journey as I watched the fallen leaves of autumn being carried away by the wind. From this day forth, I shall be called a wanderer, leaving on a journey thus among the early showers. You will again sleep night after night, nestled among the flowers of Sanakwa. The second of these poems was written to encourage me by Chotaro, a native of Iwaki, when he held a farewell party for me at the house of Kikaku. It is winter now, but when the spring comes, your bundle shall contain cherry blossoms of Yoshino. This poem was an extremely courteous gift of Lord Rosen. Other friends, relatives, and students of mine followed his example by visiting me with poems and letters of farewell, or sending me money for straw sandals, so that I was spared the trouble of preparing for my journey, which normally, it is said, takes as long as 3 months. In fact, everything I needed for my journey, the paper raincoat, the cotton stuffed mantle, the hat, the stockings, etc., to keep me warm in the dead of winter, was given me by my friends, and as I was invited to parties on a boat at my friends' houses, or even at my own hermitage, I became used to the pomp and splendor of feasting unawares, and almost fell a victim to the illusion that a man of importance was leaving on a journey. From time immemorial, the art of keeping diaries while on the road was popular among the people, and such great writers as Lord Ki, Chomei, and the nun Abutsu brought it to perfection. Later works are by and large little more than imitations of these great masters, and my pen, being weak in wisdom and unfavored by divine gift, strives to equal them, but in vain. It is easy enough to say, for example, that such and such a day was rainy in the morning but fine in the afternoon, that there was a pine tree at such and such a place, or that the name of the river at a certain place was such and such, for these things are what everybody says in their diaries, although in fact they are not even worth mentioning unless there are fresh and arresting elements in them. The readers will find in my diary a random collection of what I have seen on the road, views somehow remaining in my heart, an isolated house in the mountains, or lonely inn surrounded by the moor, for example. I jotted down these records with the hope that they might provoke pleasant conversation among my readers, and that they might be of some use to those who would travel the same way. Nevertheless, I must admit that my records are little more than the babble of the intoxicated and the rambling talk of the dreaming, and therefore my readers are kindly requested to take them as such. I stopped overnight at Narumi. The voices of plovers invite me to stare into the darkness of the starlit promontory. The host of the inn told me that Lord Asukai Masaki had once lodged here on his way from Kyoto, and left behind him the following poem in his own handwriting. As I stand alone on the beach of Narumi, I feel the expanse of the sea that severs me so from the ancient capital. I myself wrote, only half the way I came to the ancient capital, and above my head, clouds heavy with snow. I wanted to visit Tokoku at his hermitage in the village of Hobi in the province of Mikawa. I first sent for Etsujin, and we walked together 25 miles or so in the direction of the village till we put up at an inn in Yoshida. Cold as it was, we felt secure, sleeping together in the same room. I followed a narrow winding path in the middle of rice fields at Amatsunawa-te among the biting blasts from the sea. In the sun of a cold winter day, my shadow had frozen stiff on horseback. The promontory of Irago was about a mile from the village of Hobi. One could reach it by land from the province of Mikawa, but from the province of Ise one had to cross the ocean, and yet it was somehow included among the sights of Ise by a poet of Manyoshu. I picked some pebbles on the beach, the so-called white stones of Irago used for the games of Go. Mount Hanayama behind was famous for hawks, for this southern promontory was one of the places where hawks came very early each year. Just as I was trying to recall ancient poems on the hawk, by a singular stroke of luck I saw, a solitary hawk circling above the promontory of Irago. The Atsuta shrine was under reconstruction. Not a flaw there is on the polished surface of the divine glass, chased with flowers of snow. I was invited to Nagoya City, a city to the west of Atsuta Shrine, to have a short rest. Surely there must be someone crossing the pass of Hakone on this snowy morning. I was invited to a party. Stretching by force the wrinkles of my coat, I started out on a walk to a snow viewing party. Deep as the snow is, let me go as far as I can till I stumble and fall, viewing the white landscape. I was a guest poet at my friend's house. Searching for the scent of the early plum, I found it by the eaves of a proud storehouse. During my stay in Nagoya, I composed quite a number of linked verses, long and short, with my friends who had come from Ogaki and Gifu. I left Nagoya, however, several days after December the 10th, headed for my native place. Spending an idle day at an inn, I saw people dusting their houses at the end of the year. At the village of Hinaga, where it is said an ancient poet coming from Kuwana found himself almost starved to death, I hired a horse and climbed the steep slope of the support yourself on a stick path. As I was unaccustomed to horse riding, however, I had a fall at one point, the saddle and myself overthrown by a jerk. Had I crossed the pass, supported by a stick, I would have spared myself the fall from the horse. Out of the depressing feeling that accompanied the fall, I wrote the above poem impromptu, but found it devoid of the seasonal word. Coming home at last, at the end of the year, I wept to find my old umbilical cord. Unwilling to part with the passing year, I drank till late on the last day of December. When I awoke after a long sleep, the first day of the new year was more than half gone. On the second, at least, I will get up early to give welcome to the floral spring. Scenes of early spring. Fresh spring. The world is only 9 days old. These fields and mountains. Heated spring air in tiny waves of an inch or two above wintry grass. There was the ruined site of the temple built by the high priest Shunjo at the village of Awa in the province of Iga. The name of this temple was known to have been Gohozan Shindai Butsuji, but now this long name alone was the witness of its past glory. The main hall had been completely destroyed, leaving only foundations, and the priest's living quarters had been reduced to paddies and fields. The tall statue of Buddha, originally 6 feet and 6 inches tall, had become covered with green moss, save for the divine face that shone forth as in former days. The image of the founder stood erect, but it was a pity to see it among the ruins, where sagebrush and other weeds had grown rank on empty stone platforms and pedestals. Dead, too, were the couple of sacred sal trees that had once been the pride of the temple. Almost as high as the crumbled statue, the heated air shimmering from the stone foundation. Many things of the past are brought to my mind as I stand in the garden staring at a cherry tree. I paid a visit to the shrine at Ise Yamada. Not knowing the name of the tree, I stood in the flood of its sweet smell. It is a bit too cold to be naked in this stormy wind of February. At Bodai-san, tell me the loneliness of this deserted mountain, the aged farmer digging wild potatoes. Upon meeting my friend, Ryu Sosha, before all else tell me the name of this rush, I said to the scholar, pointing to the young leaves. I met Setsudo, son of Ajiro Mimbu. A young shoot has borne beautiful flowers, growing upon an aged plum tree. I was invited to a hermitage. Surrounded by potato fields, the gate stands half buried by the fresh leaves of goose grass. I wondered why there was not a single plum tree in the holy compound of the Ise shrine. The priest, however, told me that there was no special reason, and that I could find a solitary stalk in the back of the house where the sacred virgins lived. How befitting it is for holy virgins, a solitary stalk of fragrant plum. What a stroke of luck it is to see a picture of Nirvana in his holy compound. When the middle of March came, I no longer suppressed the desire to leave for Yoshino, for in my mind the cherry blossoms were already in full bloom. There was a man who promised to accompany me to Yoshino at the promontory of Irago, and he joined me at Ise. He was eager to enjoy various views with me and also to help me as a servant while on the road. He changed his name to Mangiku Maru, which I liked exceedingly for its boyish flavor. We celebrated our start by scribbling on our hats, "Nowhere in this wide universe have we a fixed abode," a party of 2 wanderers. Wait a while, I will show you the cherries of Yoshino, my cypress hat. Wait a while, my cypress hat, I will show you too the cherries of Yoshino. Written by Mangiku Maru. I threw away quite a number of things, for I believed in traveling light. There were certain things, however, I had to carry on my back, such as a raincoat, an overcoat, an inkstone, a brush, writing paper, medicine, a lunch basket, and these constituted quite a load for me. I made such slow progress that I felt deeply depressed as I walked along with faltering steps, giving as much power as I could to my trembling knees. Tired of walking, I put up at an inn, embraced comfortably by wisteria flowers. At Hatsuse, there is a man sitting for meditation in a temple corner on a spring night. Priests are walking in high clogs among the rain that falls on cherry blossoms. Written by Mangiku. At Mount Kazuraki. God of this mountain, may you be kind enough to show me your face among the dawning blossoms. After visits to Mount Miwa and Mount Tafu, I climbed the steep pass of Hoso. Higher than the lark, I climbed into the air, taking breath at the summit of a pass. At the waterfall called Dragon's Gate, a spray of blossoms on the Dragon's Gate would be an excellent gift for tipplers. Tipplers would be overjoyed to hear from me about the bridge of blossoms across the waterfall. At Nijiko, one after another, in silent succession fall the flowers of yellow rose, the roar of tumbling water. I visited the waterfalls of Seirei, Furu, Numbiki, and Mino, the second being slightly less than half a mile from the shrine of Furu, and the last on the way to the temple of Kachio. Cherry blossoms. From 5 to 6 miles, I walk every day in search of you, cherry blossoms. Cherry blossoms in the darkening sky, and among them a melancholy, ready to bloom tomorrow. Using my fan for a cup, I pretended to drink under the scattering cherry. Upon seeing a crystal spring coming out of a mossy rock, the spring rain must have penetrated through the leaves to feed the crystal spring. During my 3 days' stay in Yoshino, I had a chance to see the cherry blossoms at different hours of the day. At early dawn, late in the evening, or past midnight when the dying moon was in the sky. Overwhelmed by the scenes, however, I was not able to compose a single poem. My heart was heavy, for I remembered the famous poems of Sesshoku, Saigyo, Teshitsu, and other ancient poets. In spite of the ambitiousness of my original purpose, I thus found the present journey utterly devoid of poetic success. At Mount Koya, hearing a pheasant in the mountains, I pine with the warmest love for my father and mother. Because of my hair, I suffered a humiliation under the scattering cherry at the holiest of shrines. Written by Mangiku. At Wakanoura, abreast I am at last, with the fleeing spring here in the open bay of Wakanoura. I wrote this poem in the temple of Kimidera looking at the sea. Dragging my sore heels, I plodded along like Saigyo, all the time with the memory of his suffering at the river Tenryu in my mind. And when I hired a horse, I thought of the famous priest who had experienced the disgrace of being thrown from his horse into a moat. Nevertheless, it was a great pleasure to see the marvelous beauties of nature, rare scenes in the mountains or along the coast, or to visit the sites of temporary abodes of ancient sages, where they had spent secluded lives, or better still, to meet people who had entirely devoted themselves to the search for artistic truth. Since I had nowhere permanent to stay, I had no interest whatever in keeping treasures. And since I was empty-handed, I had no fear of being robbed on the way. I walked at full ease, scorning the pleasure of riding in a palanquin, and filled my hungry stomach with coarse food, shunning the luxury of meat. I bent my steps in whatever direction I wished, having no itinerary to follow. My only mundane concerns were whether I would be able to find a suitable place to sleep at night, and whether the straw sandals were the right size for my feet. Every turn of the road brought me new thoughts, and every sunrise gave me fresh emotions. My joy was great when I encountered anyone with the slightest understanding of artistic elegance. Even those whom I had long hated for being antiquated and stubborn sometimes proved to be pleasant companions on my wandering journey. Indeed, one of the greatest pleasures of traveling was to find a genius hidden among weeds and bushes, a treasure lost in broken tiles, a mass of gold buried in clay. And when I did find such a person, I always kept a record, with the hope that I might be able to show it to my friends. The day for the spring change of clothing came. I took a kimono off to feel lighter, only putting it in the load on my back. The moment I descended Mount Yoshino, I sought to sell my cotton-stuffed coat, written by Mangiku. I was in Nara on Buddha's birthday and saw the birth of a fawn. I was so struck by the coincidence that I wrote. By what divine consideration is it, I wonder, that this fawn is born on Buddha's birthday? Ganjin, founder of the Shodaiji temple, is said to have lost his sight on his way to Japan on account of the salt that jumped into his eyes while he endured 70 different trials on the sea. After bowing devoutly before his statue, I wrote, "If only you allow me, I will willingly wipe salt tears from your eyes with these fresh leaves." I parted from an old friend of mine in Nara. Just as a stag's antlers are split into tines, so I must go willy-nilly, separated from my friend. At a certain man's home in Osaka, to talk casually about an iris flower is one of the pleasures of the wandering journey. At the beach of Suma, the moon is in the sky, but as if someone were absent, the whole scene is empty. The summer at Suma. I saw the moon, but somehow I was left unsatisfied. The summer at Suma. It was in the middle of April when I wandered out to the beach of Suma. The sky was slightly overcast, and the moon on a short night of early summer had special beauty. The mountains were dark with foliage. When I thought it was about time to hear the first voice of the cuckoo, the light of the sun touched the eastern horizon, and as it increased, I began to see on the hills of Ueno ripe ears of wheat tinged with reddish brown, and fishermen's huts scattered here and there among the flowers of white poppy. At sunrise, I saw tanned faces of fishermen among the flowers of white poppy. There were 3 villages on this beach: Higashi-suma, Nishi-suma, and Hama-suma. None of these villages, however, seemed to have a distinctive local trade. According to an ancient poet, there used to be a great number of salt farms on the beach, but they must have gone out of existence years before. I saw small fish called kisugo spread on the sand to be dried. Some villagers, they hardly seemed professional fishermen, were guarding the fish against the crows that dived to grab them. Each had a bow and arrow in his hand. I wondered why these people still resorted to such a cruel means without the slightest sense of guilt, and thought of the bloody war that had taken place in the mountains at the back of the beach. I wanted to see the site of this old war, so I started to climb Mount Tetsukai. The boy who had been acting as my guide, however, did not like the idea and tried every means to evade it. I coaxed him by saying that I would buy him a dinner after our return, and the boy began to walk, submitting to my request. This boy was 16, I was told, but he looked much younger than the other boys I had seen in the village. He walked in front of me, climbing several hundreds of feet through a steep rocky path with many a turn. He slipped countless times, but always clinging to a root of bamboo or wild azalea. He led the way, completely out of breath, and with his brow sweating profusely. It was indeed thanks to this wild effort of the young guide that I was able to reach the gateway of clouds. Off the sharp point of a fisherman's arrow, I heard the cry of a wild cuckoo. Where the cuckoo's voice glided into the sea, shooting across the sky, I found an island. In the temple of Suma, under the shade of a tree, I thought I had heard an ancient flute on the march. I stopped overnight at Akashi. Settled in trap pots, octopuses may be exulting in their ecstasy of a single night under the moon of summer. It was by a singular stroke of genius that an ancient writer pointed out that autumn was the best season to visit this beach, for it seemed to me that the scene excelled in loneliness and isolation at that season. It was, on the other hand, an incurable folly of mine to think that I had come here in autumn, that had I come here in autumn, I would have had a greater poetic success, for that only proved the poverty of my mind. The island of Awaji lay just across a narrow strip of water, and the corresponding hill on the mainland side divided the beach of Suma on the left and that of Akashi on the right. I was reminded of a similar scene on the border of Go and So in China, but a man of greater learning would have thought of many other scenes of a similar nature. There was a small village called Tainohata in the mountains behind, and this was the birthplace of the 2 sisters, Matsukaze and Murasame. From this village I followed a narrow ridge road leading to the province of Tamba, through many a precipice have such fearful names as Hell's Window and Headlong Fall. When I came to Ichinotani, the huge precipice where Yoshitsune had performed the feat of a downhill rush with great success, I looked down into the valley over the pine trees on which he had hung his war gong and saw the site of his enemy's camp directly below my eyes. The great confusion of the day, together with other tragic incidents of the time, rose afresh in my mind, and I saw before me the aged grandmother of the young emperor taking him in her arms, his mother carrying him on her shoulders, his legs pitifully tangled with her dress, and all of them running into a boat to escape the onslaught of the enemy. Various ladies of the court followed them and threw into the boat all kinds of things, rare musical instruments, for example, wrapped in sheets and quilts. Many things of value, however, must have fallen overboard. Imperial food into the sea for the fish to feed upon, and ladies' vanity boxes onto the sand to be quite forgotten among the grass. This is probably why, even today, after 1,000 years, the waves break on this beach with such a melancholy sound.